My name is Alexei Petrov, and I am an independent journalist specializing in investigating abandoned towns and their hidden stories. Over the years, I have traveled through countless ghost villages and towns, each with its own narrative of desolation and oblivion. However, one of my most peculiar journeys was to Kadikchon, a mining settlement in the far east of Russia, now reduced to rubble and silence. Kadikchon was built during World War II by Gulag prisoners. Intended for coal extraction to fuel Soviet machinery, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the demand for coal drastically decreased, and in 1996 a methane explosion in one of the mines claimed the lives of 6 miners, precipitating the total abandonment of the place. Today the ruins of Kadikchon lie forgotten, accessible only through the treacherous Road of Bones, a grim reminder of the lives lost during its construction. My arrival in Kadikchon was marked by an unsettling feeling I couldn't shake. The deserted streets, crumbling buildings, and omnipresent stillness created an oppressive atmosphere. My goal was to document the current state of the town and, if I was lucky, uncover some trace of its past. While exploring the ruins, I came across the old library, surprisingly intact despite the passage of time. Among dusty shelves and faded books, I discovered a set of partially burned diaries and letters hidden under debris. Curiosity drove me to collect them and take them to the place where I was staying to examine them carefully. That night, under the dim light of a lamp, I began to decipher the legible fragments of the documents. The words, though often incomplete, painted a disturbing picture of the days leading up to Kadikchon's abandonment. A diary belonging to someone named Sergei Ivanov, dated November 1996, recounted growing tensions between the miners and local authorities. It mentioned rumors of unsafe conditions in the mine and questionable decisions made by the administration. Another letter, written by a woman named Elena Kuznetsova, described her concern for her husband's health, a miner who had returned home with inexplicable symptoms. She spoke of other workers falling ill as well, and how the authorities dismissed their concerns. These accounts contrasted with the official version of the accident, an unexpected and tragic methane explosion. As I continued reading, a disturbing pattern emerged. Several entries and letters hinted at prior issues in the mine, ignored warning signs, and constant pressure to maintain production at all costs. Some documents even suggested that the miners had expressed concerns about gas buildup and inadequate equipment maintenance. These revelations led me to question the official narrative. Was the 1996 accident truly an unforeseen event, or the result of systematic negligence? The consistency of the testimonies in the documents pointed to the latter. I decided to explore the town further in search of additional evidence. I visited the mining administration building, now in ruins. Among piles of discarded papers and rusted filing cabinets, I found inspection reports noting repeated safety violations and unimplemented recommendations. These reports, dated months before the accident, warned of the urgent need to repair ventilation systems and monitor gas levels. The picture that emerged was clear and disheartening. The tragedy of Kadikchon was not a mere accident, but the result of a chain of negligent decisions and a culture of indifference toward workers' safety. The lives lost and the subsequent abandonment of the town were direct consequences of these failures. As I concluded my investigation, I sat in the town's central square, reflecting on what I had discovered. The empty structures and silent streets seemed to whisper stories of interrupted lives and vanished dreams. The desolation of Kadikchon served as a grim reminder of the consequences of negligence and dehumanization. As I left, I carried with me not only documents and photographs, but also a sense of heaviness. The story of Kadikchon, with its hidden truths and silenced voices, weighed on my conscience. I knew that even if I shared my findings, the town's fate would remain unchanged, a mute testament to past mistakes and unlearned lessons, a terrible event, and forgotten diaries revealing a story of negligence. My name is Jean-Pierre Dubois, and I am a historian specializing in World War II events. For years I have traveled across France documenting testimonies and gathering evidence from that dark period. However, no experience marked me as much as my visit to Oradour-sur-Glane, a small village in central France frozen in time since June 10, 1944. What I experienced there defies all logic and comprehension, and though I have hesitated to share it, I feel it is my duty to do so. I had read and heard about the massacre of Oradour, where 642 inhabitants were killed by an SS division. The French government decided to preserve the village in its destroyed state as a perpetual reminder of the atrocities committed. My intention was to study the site, analyze the structures, and perhaps find some overlooked detail from previous investigations. I arrived on a grey, cloudy morning, which heightened the place's somber atmosphere. As I walked through the deserted streets, the burned facades and abandoned personal objects gave the impression that time had abruptly stopped. Rusted cars remained on the streets, and the tram tracks still crossed the village, though they no longer led anywhere. As I moved forward, I took notes and photographs, trying to capture the essence of what daily life had been like before the tragedy. I stopped in front of the church, where it was known that women and children had been locked inside and later killed. The structure, though damaged, still stood as a silent witness to that horror. I decided to enter. The interior was dark and smelled of dampness and ash. The charred benches and destroyed altar spoke of the violence unleashed at the time. While exploring, I noticed something strange. A slight breeze, though all the windows were closed. A chill ran down my spine, but I attributed it to the emotional weight of the place. I continued my tour of the village, stopping at what remained of the school, the cafe, and the shops. Each place seemed to whisper stories of truncated lives. In one of the houses, I saw a dust-covered sewing machine, as if its owner had stepped out for a moment and never returned. As evening fell, I decided to review my notes and recordings in a small room I had set up in one of the few partially intact structures. While listening to the recordings, I noticed interference and barely audible whispers. I thought it might be an equipment failure or external interference, though I knew I was alone and far from any signal source. Night fell quickly, and the sense of isolation deepened. The shadows of the ruins stretched under the moonlight, creating unsettling shapes. I decided to rest and continue my work the next day. However, at some point in the night, a sound woke me. It was subtle, like the creaking of a door. I got up and, armed with a flashlight, went out to investigate. The streets were deserted and the silence was overwhelming. But as I passed through the central square, I thought I saw a figure in the distance. I blinked in surprise, and at that moment the figure disappeared. My heart was pounding, but I convinced myself it was a product of my exhaustion and suggestibility. It was around midnight when I began to hear the first sounds. At first they were faint, almost imperceptible, but then they became clearer. It was as if someone was crying in the distance, a high-pitched wail that slipped through the crumbling walls and echoed through the streets. Then came the screams of pain, of desperation, like those of someone about to experience something horrific. They weren't distant echoes. They were voices that seemed to move between the houses, inside the church and around the square, and then suddenly they faded. I stood frozen for a long time, unsure whether to flee or keep investigating. Finally, I returned to my room, but sleep didn't come. I spent the rest of the night reviewing my notes and trying to rationalize my experiences. At dawn, I decided I had gathered enough information and it was time to leave. As I left the village, I stopped one last time to look back. The ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane stood still under the morning light, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I couldn't explain it, but I felt as if the village itself held a consciousness, a living memory of past horrors. I returned to Paris and presented my findings. However, I never mentioned the personal experiences I had there. Who would believe me? A historian must rely on facts, tangible evidence. But deep within me, I know there are things that transcend human understanding, and Oradour-sur-Glane is a testament to that. Since then, I have continued my investigations, but I always avoid returning to that village. Some memories are better left in the past, though the past never truly lets us go. My name is Daniel Rios, and I am a documentary photographer specializing in capturing the essence of forgotten and abandoned places. For years I have traveled the world seeking out spaces that time and humanity have left behind, trying to tell their stories through my lens. My work has taken me to shuttered hospitals, ruined factories and deserted towns, but nothing prepared me for what I experienced in Krakow, Italy. I had heard about Krakow on several occasions, a medieval village in the Basilicata region, abandoned since the 1960s due to landslides and earthquakes. The images I had seen showed a place frozen in time, with stone buildings slowly crumbling under the southern Italian sun. I decided I had to see it for myself and document its current state. I arrived in Italy in spring, a time when the weather is kinder and the light is perfect for photography. After renting a car in Rome, I set off south, passing through landscapes that alternated between green hills and small villages steeped in history. The road grew narrower and more winding as I approached my destination, with sparse signage. Finally, after several hours of driving, I spotted the ruins of Craigslist in the distance, perched atop a hill dominating the surrounding landscape. I parked the car on the outskirts of the village, where a sign warned of the danger of collapses and prohibited entry without a guide. However, I had read that with proper precautions it was possible to explore some areas on my own. Equipped with my camera, a flashlight, and a backpack with basic supplies, I began to ascend the cobblestone path leading to the heart of the village. The silence was absolute. Only the sound of my footsteps and the occasional song of a bird broke the stillness. The narrow, winding streets were flanked by stone buildings, many with collapsed facades and roofs. Wooden doors, some still standing, creaked softly in the wind. I stopped in the main square, where a solemn-looking church stood, defying the passage of time. While photographing the church from different angles, I noticed something peculiar. In one of the second-floor windows of an adjacent building, a curtain seemed to move slightly, as if someone had pulled it aside to watch me. I immediately assumed it must be the wind, though the breeze was almost non-existent, but I decided to investigate anyway. Upon entering the building, the smell of dampness and decay hit me immediately. The floor was covered in debris, and the sparse furniture lay broken and scattered. I climbed the stairs cautiously, avoiding areas that seemed unstable. When I reached the second floor, I went to the room whose window overlooked the square. The curtain, worn and dusty, hung motionless. There was no sign that anyone had been there recently. I took some photographs, seizing the moment, and didn't think much more of it. I continued exploring the village for several hours, marveling at the architecture and the melancholic atmosphere that permeated every corner. However, I suddenly began to feel very uneasy. On several occasions I thought I heard the sound of gravel, like footsteps, and more than once I had the impression of seeing fleeting figures in my peripheral vision. I tried to ignore these perceptions, attributing them to suggestibility. As evening fell, I decided it was time to leave. While descending the path to my car, I crossed paths with an elderly man slowly climbing with the aid of a cane. His presence surprised me, as I hadn't seen anyone else all day. As he passed, he greeted me with a slight nod and an emotionless gaze. I returned the greeting and continued on my way, but the presence of that man stayed in my mind. That night, in my hotel, I reviewed the photographs I had taken. Most were exactly as I remembered, capturing the desolation and beauty of Krakow. However, when I reached the images of the main square, I noticed something. In one of the photos, in the window where I had seen the curtain move, a human figure was clearly visible. I zoomed in, trying to discern more details, but the figure was blurry, almost as if it didn't fully belong to the surroundings. It had no defined features, just a dark silhouette standing by the window frame, looking down at me. I reviewed the other photos taken from different angles, and in at least 3 more I could make out the same shape, as if it had moved within the building, always in shadow, always watching me. I didn't sleep well that night. A part of me knew that what I had seen wasn't an optical illusion. There was something about that figure, its way of being present yet not, that felt profoundly unsettling. Still, I tried to rationalize it. I thought it might have been someone else, perhaps another explorer, or even a vagrant taking shelter in the ruins. The next morning I decided to return. I did so without announcing it, without notifying the local guide who usually accompanied tourists. I had no intention of taking more photos. I just wanted to confirm that there was nothing strange, that everything had a logical explanation. I climbed back to the heart of the village and revisited the building where I had seen the figure. Every room was empty, silent, as decayed as the day before. I found no footprints, no recent signs, no trace of human presence. However, as I left, I stopped in front of the church. Something compelled me to enter, though the doors were barely holding up. The interior was dark, the stained glass windows dusty, the altar covered in debris and cobwebs. I walked among the wooden pews to the center of the space. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe minutes, maybe more, but before leaving I heard something. It wasn't a loud noise, but a kind of dry murmur, almost like a deep exhalation, resonating just behind me. When I turned around, I felt a presence, not like an energy, but something physical, tangible. That was when I decided to leave for good. I didn't take more photos or record any videos. I just descended the hill, got into my car, and drove away. In the days that followed, I avoided reviewing the photos. I focused on other things to try to disconnect from the trip. It was weeks before I could bring myself to look at the Krakow image folder again. When I finally did, I discovered something else. In one of the last photos, one I took just before leaving on the first day, the figure appeared again. But this time it wasn't in the window, it was at the church's entrance. And it wasn't looking at me. It was facing away, as if it had let me in. I never returned to Krakow. In fact, I haven't gone back to Italy. I changed projects, and I stopped photographing abandoned villages. I've worked in many places since then, industrial ruins, forgotten asylums, war zones. But nothing compares to what I experienced in Krakow. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I felt, what stayed with me. Because sometimes it's not what you capture with the camera that weighs the most, but what you can't leave behind, what each image conveys, each shadow, each silence. Thank you for sharing my story. My name is Gabriel Mendes, and I'm an anthropologist, though at this point I'm not sure if that describes what I do or just what I studied. For several years, I've dedicated myself to documenting the remnants of ghost communities in industrial exploitation zones, particularly in South America. My work isn't exactly academic, but it's highly methodical. Documentation, photography, interviews with the last living residents, audio archives. A kind of archaeology of recent memory. It's solitary, but I like it. I've never been particularly good with large groups or social events, so diving into abandoned towns with a recorder in my bag and a notebook in my backpack ended up being the most natural thing I've ever done. In 2022, I finally decided to go to Humberston. I had already visited several abandoned nitrate offices in northern Chile, but this one was different, for its size, its history, and that frozen-in-time air that attracts photographers and seekers of the strange. I arrived in mid-September. I avoided tours, peak hours, and heritage event dates. I wanted to walk the place alone, without a guide, without external voices, without the noise of visitors taking photos in front of the saltpeter, corroded structures. I stayed in Iquique and traveled to the Pampa in a rented car, crossing that desert landscape that seems to repeat infinitely. The entrance to Humberstone is simple, with no need for pretension, as the place itself is striking. I left the car near the main entrance and started walking. I had planned to record the sound of the wind among the metal structures, the reverberations inside the theatre, the creaks of the primary school. I had it all written down. But that's not what ended up mattering. The first day was normal. It was dry heat, and the dust rose easily. I took many photos, walked the deserted streets, entered the general store, the hospital, the courtyard where rusted tools hung like mechanical skeletons. Everything seemed suspended in time with an indefinite pause. That night I reviewed the material and stored it. Everything was in order. It was on the second day that things started to change. I was walking toward the school when I heard a kind of soft hum, like electrical interference. It clearly wasn't the wind. Wind has a different kind of movement. This was more constant, more directed. I stopped with the recorder in hand and moved toward the source. It seemed to come from the side of one of the mechanical workshops. But when I got there, there was nothing. No sound, no source that caused it. I didn't dwell on it and continued my tour. I noted the incident as unidentified environmental noise and moved on. I returned to the school, which was in poor condition. There were misaligned desks and a blackboard covered with a fine layer of salt. Everything had that sepia tone that's not a filter but a consequence of the climate. I stayed there for a while. I sat at one of the desks and just listened. I didn't record anything. I just sat in silence, enjoying the solitude. At dusk, while reviewing my audio, I noticed something strange. In one of the recordings, just before the track ended, there was a voice, not a clear voice or a direct whisper. It was more like a word slipping through frequencies, as if someone had spoken very close to the microphone without being there. I couldn't make out what it said, but it was there. I played it several times, but couldn't decipher it, as it was barely audible. In the early hours, I woke up several times, and each time I closed my eyes, I had the impression I had forgotten something important. Like when you feel you left the key in the door or the gas on. That minimal, nagging anxiety that keeps you from resting. The next morning, I didn't go straight to Humberston. I stayed in the hotel reviewing the audio, trying to isolate that voice. I couldn't, but while doing so, I noticed something else. In one of the photos taken on the first day, in the background, far in the background, at one of the theatre's entrances, there was something. I wouldn't say it was a figure. It was more like a smudge, a blurry silhouette, but it wasn't in other photos from the same angle. I returned to the site at noon and entered the theatre. The echo was vast, as expected. I recorded the ambient sound, walked among the seats, and then stood on the stage. I thought about the number of people who had passed through there, their voices, their laughter, their silences. But suddenly, in that same spot, I heard something fall. A faint noise, like a small object. I turned quickly and saw a pencil rolling on the floor near the third row. There was no one else. I approached, picked it up, and kept it. It was an old-school pencil, not seeming to have been there long. That was the day I decided to stay until the place closed. The tourists left, the guides too. I hid in one of the back rooms of the hospital. I wanted to record Humberstone at night, but not for the reasons others seek. I didn't believe I was dealing with ghosts, or classic spirits. What unsettled me wasn't the presence of something, but the permanence of something. In the energy, as if the place was aware of its abandonment and used it to retain fragments of people. I thought I might sleep during the night, but I couldn't. So I left the place at dawn, with cold hands, red eyes, and an audio file I never found an explanation for. Today, 2 years later, I have that pencil on my desk. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe because I need to remember that what happened wasn't an exaggeration. A year after that trip, I returned to Humberston for the last time, without cameras, without microphones. I just walked through the abandoned town. This time I didn't see or hear anything. But as I was leaving, passing by the old administrator's house, I felt a pressure in my chest. Not from anguish or emotion, but something more physical, like a force that didn't want me to leave. At that moment, all the memories flooded back. I kept walking until I left the place, and that was the last time I visited Humberston. I've worked in other places since then, but it was never the same. Something changed after that time. Since then, when I'm alone in some ruin, when night falls, and I settle in to record the surroundings, there's always a moment when I feel I'm not the only one listening. And the worst part is, it doesn't bother me. I've grown accustomed to that intangible company.